Imagine this. You're the daughter of a beheaded queen, your stepfathers creep on you, your sister throws you in the tower, and every man who wants to marry you is secretly plotting how to steal your crown, or your head. That was Elizabeth I reality, and instead of playing the royal love game, she said, "Nah, better single than headless." This is not your Disney princess story. This is the true, horrifying reason the so-called Virgin Queen never walked down the aisle. If you think marriage today is scary, wait till you hear what it meant back then. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll either thank God you're single, or never look at history the same way again. Hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, history has never been this brutally honest. Elizabeth was born in September 1533, a child who entered a realm already thick with suspicion and death. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a union forged not in peace, but in defiance of both crown and church. The English court had expected a son and heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Instead, the infant was a girl. What should have been joy carried with it a profound disappointment, and the shadow of this discontent settled over Elizabeth's earliest existence. Her very birth was tangled in the blood of others. Henry VIII's marriage to Anne had demanded the annulment of his union with Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, a separation that had split England from the papacy and torn families across the realm into bitter divides. This act of defiance left Elizabeth's legitimacy contested from the start. To some, she was not a princess at all, but a bastard child, her claim no stronger than the fragile favor of her father's volatile temper. The executioner's axe haunted her cradle long before she could comprehend its weight. Anne Boleyn, her mother, was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges fabricated through whispers, bribes, and political convenience. When Elizabeth was barely 3 years old, Anne was taken to the scaffold. It is said that she begged the crowd to pray for the king, the very man who had condemned her. The steel blade fell swiftly, severing not only Anne's head but the bond between mother and child. Elizabeth would carry no memory of her mother's face, only the lingering consequence of her destruction. Her father remarried within days. Jane Seymour, demure and obedient, replaced the fiery Anne. The lesson was clear: queens were not partners, but pawns, easily discarded when they failed to deliver. Elizabeth, still a toddler, was stripped of her title and declared illegitimate, her place in the succession erased with a single stroke of royal decree. To survive the Tudor court meant to understand that bloodlines offered no protection, and that even a king's daughter could be reduced to nothing in an instant. The household where Elizabeth was raised reflected this instability. Servants and governesses were dismissed or replaced depending on her father's moods. She learned early to watch, to listen, and to remain silent when storms gathered. In an age where women were measured by their obedience, beauty, and fertility, Elizabeth was being forged by neglect and danger into something different, something steel, like tempered by fire. The political climate was no less perilous. Religious reforms swept across England, each shift in doctrine carrying with it the threat of violence. Those who clung to Catholic tradition were branded traitors. Those who embraced reform too fervently risked accusations of heresy. Public executions became sermons in flesh and fire. Elizabeth grew up in a land where bodies swung from gallows and the air itself carried the smell of burning martyrdom. Her half-sister Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was another shadow looming over her childhood. Mary, too, had been cast aside, branded illegitimate when her mother was displaced. The two girls were mirrors of each other, rivals born of their father's hunger for power. Their futures would collide in blood, but even in childhood, the seeds of mistrust had been sown by the cruelty of the crown. What Elizabeth could not escape was the constant reminder that her existence was born from a gamble. Her father had broken kingdoms, discarded wives, and spilled blood to secure her birth. Yet the child he received was not the male heir he had risked everything for. Elizabeth was a living symbol of ambition, failure, and the fragility of queenship. Every step she took within palace walls was shadowed by the ghost of her mother and the cold indifference of her father. The memory of Anne Boleyn's death was not spoken aloud in Elizabeth's presence, but its silence was deafening. In the court of Henry VIII, women were reduced to wombs, their worth measured in sons. Elizabeth had entered life as proof of her mother's inability to fulfill that demand. Her survival would require not tenderness, but resilience, sharpened by the lessons carved from betrayal. History would later remember her as the Virgin Queen, a sovereign who ruled alone, but her choice to remain unmarried was not born of romantic idealism. It was born in the echo of her mother's screams, the sight of queens replaced like horses in a stable, and the truth that a woman's bed could be the most dangerous battlefield in England. Elizabeth had been born in blood, and from her first breath, she understood that power was not granted. It was taken, protected, and held at great cost. Elizabeth's childhood was carved not only by absence, but by a constant presence, the ghost of Anne Boleyn. Although she had been only a toddler when the blade struck at Tower Green, Elizabeth's identity was inextricably bound to her mother's destruction. To the world, she was not simply a princess of England. She was the daughter of an executed queen, a child whose very existence carried the stench of scandal. The stigma of bastardy was not abstract. In a court where legitimacy defined both power and survival, it meant that Elizabeth's place was precarious at best, expendable at worst. Henry VIII himself had signed the decree stripping her of her title, naming her illegitimate. It was not merely an insult, it was a legal branding, one that declared to every noble and foreign court that Elizabeth was little more than a royal by accident. She bore the stain of her mother's fall in every interaction, her very presence a living reminder of treason. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Anne Boleyn's enemies had ensured that the charges against her were not just about adultery, but incest, witchcraft, and corruption of the crown. Though no evidence ever confirmed such accusations, they were immortalized in the minds of courtiers. To them, Elizabeth was not just the daughter of a dead queen, she was the offspring of sin. In private corners of the court, there were mutterings that her blood carried her mother's ambition, her seduction, and her downfall. Every discussion of Elizabeth's marriage prospects was poisoned by this legacy. Suitors from abroad considered the match with suspicion. Was she a true princess, or a bastard without rights? Would a union with her bind them to Henry's fractured kingdom, or to the cursed memory of a woman executed as an adulteress? In diplomatic negotiations, Anne's name was invoked not as history, but as warning, a sign that to wed Elizabeth might invite disaster. The irony was cruel. Elizabeth had been only a child, powerless in her mother's fate, yet she carried the punishment of it into her future. Every time she was measured for her worth as a bride, the ghost of Anne Boleyn stood between her and acceptance. The scaffold that had ended Anne's life cast a shadow so long it reached into her daughter's every possibility. Yet Elizabeth absorbed the lesson. In a court where women were reduced to their marriages, she began to see intimacy not as safety, but as peril. The story of her mother was not one of love or triumph, but of betrayal and execution. To bind oneself to a man was to risk destruction. Queens could be crowned in splendor, only to die in disgrace. Elizabeth's path toward solitude, toward the creation of her image as the Virgin Queen, began here, in the haunting knowledge that intimacy was not sanctuary, but danger. The stigma extended beyond politics into her daily life. Courtiers watched her with suspicion. Some servants treated her coldly, careful not to attach themselves to a child whose future seemed unstable. Even family ties could not erase the mark. Mary, her older half-sister, had once been displaced by Anne's rise and Catherine of Aragon's fall. Though their relationship was shaped by circumstance more than affection, there was an unspoken resentment that lingered between them. Elizabeth's very existence had come at Mary's expense. The culture of Tudor England amplified this isolation. In a society where a woman's reputation was her most fragile possession, Elizabeth's was stained before she could defend it. She grew into adolescence aware that any misstep, any sign of weakness, could be twisted into proof that she carried her mother's fatal flaws. Silence became her shield, watchfulness her weapon. She learned to listen without speaking, to observe without revealing. In every gaze, she sensed judgment, The question of whether she too would fall as Anne had fallen. Religion deepened the wound. To Catholics, Elizabeth was not merely illegitimate but a heretic's child. Anne Boleyn was seen as the symbol of Henry VIII's break with Rome, the woman whose allure had torn England from papal authority. Elizabeth bore the consequence of that rupture, branded a reminder of schism and betrayal. For Protestants, she was no savior either. She was too young, too vulnerable, and still a daughter of suspicion. Her identity was not her own to shape. It had been carved in advance by her mother's death. What made the stigma unbearable was its permanence. Anne's fall had not been a temporary disgrace that faded with time. It was a scandal etched into English memory, replayed in whispers for decades. No marriage, no title, no alliance could erase it. Elizabeth carried the ghost of her mother as one might carry an open wound. Always vulnerable, always remembered, never healed. In this crucible, Elizabeth's understanding of power began to sharpen. She could not rely on lineage, hers was tainted. She could not rely on marriage, her prospects were poisoned. What remained was survival through self-control, through a careful crafting of her own identity. To escape her mother's shadow, she would have to become something untouchable, something unassailable. The child who had been branded a bastard would learn to wield that very label as armor. But in these early years, before her reign, before her legend, she was simply a girl haunted by the whispers of a mother she could never forget, though she had never known her. Elizabeth was a child of royalty, but not of safety. Born the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, her very existence was tangled in scandal and blood. By the time she was 14, her father was dead, her mother long executed, and she was a young girl navigating a world in which women's bodies were considered tools of politics, alliance, and ambition. Elizabeth, already branded as illegitimate by many, lived under constant scrutiny. She was intelligent, sharp, and aware of how fragile her place at court truly was. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the violation that came from within the walls of her own home. After Henry VIII's death in 1547, Elizabeth moved into the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. Catherine had been Henry's last wife, a woman of dignity, intelligence, and reformist faith. Elizabeth's presence there seemed natural, almost comforting. Catherine Parr was a maternal figure, offering guidance and stability to the teenage princess. But alongside Catherine stood her new husband, Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour and uncle to King Edward VI. Seymour was a man of ambition, charm, and unchecked appetite. He was nearly 40, and where others saw Elizabeth as a child, he saw an opportunity. It began with dawn intrusions. Seymour would enter Elizabeth's chambers early in the morning, while she still lay in bedclothes. At first, he played the part of jester, tugging at her blankets or calling her awake. But the behavior escalated quickly. He began to tickle her, a grotesque act when directed at a young girl under his wardship. Soon, he took a knife to her gowns, slashing them open under the guise of horseplay, leaving her humiliated, her body exposed against her will. These acts were not innocent. They were predatory. In Tudor England, the private body of a royal girl was not hers alone. It belonged to history, to politics, and to the ambitions of men like Seymour. Catherine Parr, at first, joined in with strained laughter, a disturbing reminder of how normalized such behavior could be in that era. The Queen Dowager likely believed it harmless teasing, though the cruelty of the moments cannot be diminished. Yet even Catherine could not ignore the deepening impropriety. When she found Seymour holding Elizabeth in his arms, their bodies too close, she recognized the threat. Still, she hesitated to intervene fully, bound by loyalty to her husband and fear of scandal. In Tudor England, a young girl's reputation was as fragile as glass. One crack could shatter her prospects forever. The household whispers grew louder. Servants spoke of Seymour's attentions. His games with Elizabeth were no secret. It was only when Catherine Parr discovered Seymour and Elizabeth alone in an embrace that she finally acted. Elizabeth was sent away from the household in disgrace, her name already clouded by suspicion. Though she was the victim, it was she who carried the burden of shame. Tudor society placed blame not on powerful men but on young women whose chastity was considered their only true asset. Elizabeth, a girl of 14, was treated as though she had invited corruption. For Elizabeth, the trauma was twofold. She endured the physical predation of a man nearly 3 times her age, and she bore the crushing weight of public dishonor. Rumors spread that Seymour had planned to marry her if Catherine Parr died, perhaps even to seize control of the throne through her. When Catherine died in childbirth in 1548, those whispers became accusations. Seymour's ambitions were laid bare, and Elizabeth's name was dragged once more into dangerous speculation. Was she complicit? Had she encouraged him? Such questions followed her like a shadow, long after Seymour himself was condemned and executed for treason. The scars of those years cannot be underestimated. Elizabeth learned, brutally and young, the vulnerability of being female in a court ruled by ambition. She saw how her body was politicized, how a man's desire could transform into national scandal, and how quickly a girl could be destroyed by whispers. These lessons shaped her path as queen. Elizabeth grew into the Virgin Queen, not out of coldness or unnatural detachment, but because she understood, more than most, the cost of intimacy in a world of predators. History often paints Seymour as reckless rather than monstrous, a man undone by ambition, but this minimizes the reality. To a 14-year-old girl, his actions were not politics, they were violation. Elizabeth was never allowed to speak of it openly. Instead, she carried the silence, her resilience forged in an atmosphere of humiliation and fear. In later years, when men pressed her to marry, to submit her body and crown to a husband, she resisted. Some saw arrogance, others saw wisdom. Yet beneath the political calculation, there may have remained the memory of a locked door opening at dawn, of laughter masking abuse, of a girl betrayed within the safety of her own household. The Tower of London was not merely a fortress. It was a place of dread, a stone labyrinth echoing with the voices of the condemned. To be sent there was rarely a prelude to release. For most, it was the final stop before execution. When Elizabeth Tudor, then only 20 years old, was carried through its gates in March 1554, the sight of its cold towers must have pierced her with terror. She knew its history too well. Her own mother, Anne Boleyn, had entered those same gates and never left alive. Now, Elizabeth followed her mother's footsteps, branded a traitor, a prisoner of the crown, and a woman whose very existence threatened a queen's rule. The accusation was treason. Elizabeth stood accused of complicity in Wyatt's rebellion, a rising against Queen Mary, her half-sister. The rebellion was fueled by anger against Mary's decision to marry Philip of Spain, a union many in England feared would drag the nation into foreign domination and religious suppression. To the rebels, Elizabeth represented hope, a Protestant alternative to Mary's Catholic reign. They claimed she was their figurehead, their rightful leader. But Elizabeth had not openly joined them. Her only crime was being a Tudor of royal blood, Protestant in faith, and a woman whom the people might rally behind. Mary, deeply insecure on her throne, saw Elizabeth as a mortal danger. The queen could not ignore that her younger sister was both charismatic and intelligent, nor could she ignore the rumors that England looked to Elizabeth as a savior. It was enough. Elizabeth was arrested and forced on a journey from Ashridge to London, guarded by soldiers, her body weakened by illness, her spirit pressed under the weight of dread. When she arrived at the Tower, she was carried across the Traitor's Gate, the same water entrance through which her mother had passed to her death. The symbolism was undeniable. Inside, the Tower was cold, its stone walls thick with the memory of suffering. Elizabeth was lodged in rooms that once housed Anne Boleyn before her execution. Every creak of timber, every echoing footstep carried the memory of her mother's final days. For Elizabeth, this was not simply imprisonment. It was a haunting, a collision of past and present. She knew well what it meant for women of her bloodline to be accused. Her mother had been queen, and yet could not escape the axe. What chance had she, a girl accused of conspiracy, under the rule of a queen who already mistrusted her? Elizabeth proclaimed her innocence with desperate clarity. She begged to be heard, demanded witnesses, swore she had no part in the rebellion. Yet in Tudor England, innocence was no shield. Guilt could be manufactured, and suspicion alone could condemn. The interrogations were designed not to find truth, but to extract submission. Elizabeth refused to sign confessions, refused to implicate herself or others. In her silence and her denials, she showed the steel that would later define her reign. But in that moment, she was no queen. She was a prisoner staring at walls that whispered death. The Tower had seen countless women destroyed. Lady Jane Grey, the tragic Queen of 9 Days, had been held there only months before. She was just 17 when she walked to the scaffold within the Tower grounds, her head severed for political convenience. Elizabeth could not have ignored the presence of Jane's ghost. The very air was thick with fear, the weight of young women crushed under ambition and betrayal. Elizabeth may have been royal, but she was not untouchable. Queen Mary hesitated, however. Though she despised her sister, she lacked the evidence to execute her. Killing Elizabeth without proof risked outrage, even rebellion. Philip of Spain, her soon-to-be husband, counseled caution. To execute a princess beloved by many could spark greater unrest than sparing her. So Elizabeth remained in the Tower, suspended between life and death, neither condemned nor absolved. During her imprisonment, she is said to have scratched a message into a window with a diamond, leaving words that outlived her confinement. Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be. It was a quiet act of defiance, a declaration that she would not accept shame imposed by others. Whether she truly inscribed those words, or whether they are legend, they captured the essence of her captivity: suspicion without proof, accusation without justice. The months dragged on. Elizabeth waited, hearing executions echo through the walls, never knowing if the next day would bring her own death warrant. Each sound of the axe outside could have been for her, for a woman who had already endured violation, scandal, and whispers of illegitimacy. This was another crucible. The Tower was not just a prison, it was a psychological weapon. It reminded her daily of how swiftly a Tudor woman could fall from grace to death. At last, in May 1554, Elizabeth was released from the Tower, though not freed. She was sent instead to house arrest at Woodstock, watched closely, her life still precarious. The release did not erase the terror she had endured. Rather, it carved into her memory the knowledge that her survival was never guaranteed, that her life balanced constantly on the whims of monarchs, councils, and foreign powers. This experience deepened Elizabeth's resolve. When she later reigned as queen, she refused to let herself be trapped by marriage, alliance, or dependence on men. She had lived the consequences of political marriage. Mary's union with Philip had nearly destroyed England, and Elizabeth's own supposed suitability as a bride had almost cost her life. Marriage, to her, was not security but danger, not promise but peril. The marriage of Queen Mary to Philip of Spain in 1554 was more than a royal wedding. It was a collision of nations, faiths, and ambitions. For Mary, it represented the restoration of Catholic unity and the hope of an heir to secure her throne. For Philip, it was a political conquest, England bound to Spain by the body of its queen. But for Elizabeth, then a cautious, watchful prisoner turned survivor, the marriage was a revelation. She witnessed how quickly a queen could vanish behind her husband's authority, how a crown could become a cage, and how a woman's body was reduced to nothing more than the battlefield of dynastic desire. Mary was nearly 40 at the time of her marriage. She was desperate for an heir, driven by the memory of her mother's humiliation at the hands of Henry VIII and by her own fragile claim to legitimacy. To secure the Catholic faith in England, she sought alliance with the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, Philip, son of Charles V, heir to a vast empire stretching from Spain to the Americas. The match terrified her subjects. They feared their queen would become no more than a Spanish puppet, that England itself would be swallowed into Philip's dominion. When the marriage was announced, rebellion erupted. Sir Thomas Wyatt led thousands in protest, fearing the loss of English independence. The revolt was crushed, and Elizabeth, suspected of sympathy with the rebels, was thrown into the Tower. Thus, even before the marriage was consummated, it had already brought terror into Elizabeth's life. To her, it was proof that matrimony could ruin not only queens but entire kingdoms. The wedding took place at Winchester Cathedral in July 1554. Mary, robed in gold and crimson, stood solemnly at the altar beside a man she had barely met. Philip, a foreign prince in a foreign land, towered over her. He was younger by a decade, cold and politically calculating. Though the marriage treaty promised that England would remain independent, the reality was very different. Philip insisted on being crowned alongside Mary. He signed state documents as king. He commanded soldiers. And though English law technically restrained him, in practice his presence overshadowed Mary at every turn. Mary, deeply devoted to her husband, allowed his dominance. She adored him, clung to him, and prayed that their union would produce a child. But the nation saw only humiliation. Crowds were silent when Philip appeared in public. The English people resented the sight of Spanish courtiers at court, of foreign influence seeping into their laws and policies. For Elizabeth, watching from enforced distance, the message was carved in stone: marriage stripped queens of their authority, their individuality, and even their dignity. The most grotesque chapter of Mary's marriage came in the form of phantom pregnancies. Twice, Mary announced with joy that she was with child. Bells rang across the kingdom, bonfires lit, prayers offered for the long-awaited heir. But no baby came. Instead, Mary's body swelled with illness, perhaps a tumor, perhaps false hope turned physical torment. She was left humiliated, her reputation mocked, her body betrayed. For Elizabeth, the lesson was brutal. To marry as queen was to gamble one's legitimacy on fertility. To fail was to be exposed, ridiculed, diminished. A queen's worth was measured not by her mind or her rule, but by her womb. While Mary's body failed her, Philip turned away. He left for Spain, abandoning her in loneliness. Letters poured from her hands, desperate pleas for his return, pathetic in their yearning. She was Queen of England, yet reduced to a discarded wife begging for attention. Philip returned briefly, only when political expedience demanded it. He used her throne to launch his wars, dragging England into conflict with France. The nation suffered losses, including the final fall of Calais, England's last continental possession. For Elizabeth, this was the most damning lesson of all. Through marriage, Mary had not only lost her dignity, but endangered her country. Elizabeth understood. If she married, her body would be claimed, her power divided, her kingdom entangled in foreign wars. She would become not a sovereign, but a subject, of a husband, of dynastic demands, of expectation to produce heirs at any cost. For a woman in her position, marriage was no protection. It was surrender. The death of Mary in 1558 released Elizabeth from shadow into crown. Yet the memory of her sister's marriage, its humiliations and dangers, never left her. It hardened her resolve. She would never share her throne with a man, never allow her body to be a vessel for political ambition. Elizabeth transformed her survival into a weapon, declaring herself wedded only to her kingdom. The Virgin Queen was not an emblem of chastity alone. It was a shield against the Spanish prison of marriage. From the beginning of her reign, Elizabeth kept Robert Dudley close. He was the son of John Dudley, the disgraced Duke of Northumberland, who had tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Despite his father's execution and his family's tarnished name, Robert rose in Elizabeth's favor. Handsome, athletic, and charming, he was made master of the horse, a role that placed him constantly by the Queen's side. Soon, it was impossible not to notice the intensity between them. Elizabeth was only 25 when she became queen. Surrounded by men who sought her hand for power, she looked instead to Dudley, a man she had known since childhood, a companion in her years of isolation. Their intimacy became the subject of court gossip. Elizabeth trusted him above all others, showering him with favors, keeping him close at every public event. Yet there was one obstacle: Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived far from court, a quiet shadow in the countryside. The whispers began quickly. Foreign ambassadors wrote home that Elizabeth intended to marry Dudley, that her passion for him was dangerous, that England risked scandal if the Queen wed the husband of another woman. Some went further, darkly suggesting that Amy Robsart was doomed. Elizabeth, they claimed, would stop at nothing to free Dudley for herself. In an age when royal marriage was both political and sacred, the suggestion of adultery, even unproven, was poison. Then, in September 1560, scandal erupted into reality. Amy Robsart was found dead at Cunner Place. Her body lay at the foot of a staircase, her neck broken. The official inquiry ruled it an accident, perhaps a fall, perhaps illness. But the timing was too convenient, the circumstances too suspicious. To Elizabeth's enemies, it was proof Dudley had arranged his wife's death, and the Queen had been complicit. The rumor spread like wildfire across Europe. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen of Protestant England, was painted as an adulteress and a murderess. She had not killed with axe or scaffold, but with passion and secrecy. Her body, already a political battlefield, was now stained with whispered blood. Whether she truly intended to marry Dudley or not, the possibility was destroyed. To do so would have been to invite permanent disgrace, to confirm the darkest suspicions. Even Elizabeth, headstrong and bold, knew she could not risk it. For Dudley, the scandal was ruinous. Though Elizabeth never abandoned him entirely, the dream of marriage between them was dead the moment Amy's body was discovered. He became both indispensable and untouchable, always near the Queen, never hers in public. She continued to favor him, calling him her sweet Robin, granting him estates and titles, but the possibility of true union was poisoned. Every time he drew near, the court remembered Amy's broken neck. The tragedy carved itself into Elizabeth's reign. For the rest of her life, her enemies revived the story whenever they wished to wound her. Foreign courts described her as a woman ruled by lust, incapable of ruling a kingdom. Pamphlets painted Dudley as a murderer and Elizabeth as his accomplice. Even her own subjects whispered doubts. The Virgin Queen could not afford to appear compromised, and so she learned to wield distance as armor. Love itself had become dangerous. To show affection, to trust a man openly, was to offer her enemies a weapon. Elizabeth responded by cultivating the image of unattainable majesty. She flirted, she teased, she dangled the prospect of marriage before foreign princes, but she never allowed any man to claim her. Robert Dudley remained in her orbit, but their closeness was always clouded by suspicion. He was her constant companion, yet always a reminder of the peril love brought her. Historians debate Amy Robsart's death even now. Some argue she suffered from cancer, that her bones were weakened, and that her fall was tragic but natural. Others insist foul play was involved. But for Elizabeth, the truth mattered less than the perception. In Tudor England, perception was everything. The whispers of murder could never be silenced, and so the Queen's heart was chained by scandal. In time, Dudley remarried, taking another wife in secret. Elizabeth's fury was immense. To her, it was betrayal, proof that even her closest companion could not belong entirely to her. Yet she never cast him aside completely. Until his death in 1588, Dudley remained her confidant, her favorite, the man she perhaps loved more than any other. But their bond was scarred, forever shadowed by the body of Amy Robsart. The lesson was carved deep: intimacy meant vulnerability. Elizabeth had already survived violation in her youth, imprisonment in the Tower, and the humiliation of being treated as a pawn. Now, even love itself betrayed her. From then on, she transformed her personal suffering into political strategy. The Queen became untouchable. She wore the mask of virginity, wielded affection as diplomacy, but never again allowed her heart to endanger her crown. The Tudor dynasty was forged in blood, and Elizabeth grew up knowing that women of her family were particularly vulnerable to the axe. From her earliest memories, death had been bound to queenship, marriage, and betrayal. To survive as a woman on the throne was not to reign in peace, but to balance daily on the edge of the executioner's sword. Her own mother, Anne Boleyn, was the first warning. Once radiant as Henry VIII's beloved, Anne was cast aside when her body failed to deliver a male heir. Accused of adultery and treason, charges almost certainly fabricated, she was dragged to the Tower and executed in 1536. Elizabeth was just 2 years old. She may not have remembered her mother's death, but the shadow of it clung to her for life. Her very legitimacy was tainted by Anne's blood, and the lesson was clear: a queen's marriage could end not in lifelong protection, but in public death. The second warning came in Catherine Howard. Elizabeth's cousin, young and reckless, married Henry VIII when she was still a teenager. Within 2 years, she too was accused of adultery. Dragged screaming through the corridors of Hampton Court, she was imprisoned and beheaded in 1542. Elizabeth was 9 years old. She could not ignore the truth, even innocence, even youth, could not shield a queen from the axe. Then came Lady Jane Grey. A girl of just 17, she had been forced onto the throne by the ambition of others, crowned for 9 days before Mary Tudor reclaimed her right. Elizabeth watched from the sidelines as Jane was imprisoned in the Tower, betrayed by her own family, and finally executed in 1554. Jane was no adulteress, no betrayer, only a pawn. Yet she died with her head on the block, her blood soaking the stones. Elizabeth understood. Even virtue could not protect a woman when politics demanded her death. The greatest warning of all came with Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary had been a rival and a cousin, a Catholic alternative to Elizabeth's Protestant throne. For nearly 2 decades, Mary was imprisoned in England, a living reminder that a queen could be both sacred and dangerous. In 1587, after years of plots and conspiracies woven in her name, Elizabeth signed her cousin's death warrant. The execution was brutal. Mary, tall and regal in her final moments, laid her head on the block. The axe fell clumsily, requiring more than one blow. Blood stained the floor, and even Mary's little dog, hidden in her skirts, was found soaked in it. Elizabeth never fully forgave herself for this decision, but the lesson was undeniable. Even crowned queens could not escape the sword when power demanded it. Each of these women was bound by the same fate, their crowns tethered to their bodies subjected to the axe. For Elizabeth, their deaths were not distant tragedies. They were warnings etched into her memory. She saw the pattern too clearly. Marriage placed queens at the mercy of their husbands, and politics turned their bodies into expendable offerings. Once accused, they could not defend themselves. A queen's head might be adorned with jewels one day and separated from her body the next. This knowledge carved itself into Elizabeth's reign. She walked a narrow path, always conscious of the blade that hung above her. Every decision, every refusal to marry, every cautious step in diplomacy was shaped by the ghosts of women who had fallen before her. Elizabeth knew that to give herself to a man, to risk marriage, was to place her life in his hands, and she had seen too many hands close around the hilt of the axe. Her unmarried state, so often questioned, so often mocked, was in truth her shield. By rejecting the marriage bed, she rejected the scaffold that so often followed it. She created for herself a new identity, the Virgin Queen, not out of saintly purity, but out of defiance. She would not be another name carved into the tower's stones, another queen silenced by a sword. The executioner's blade had been the final chapter for so many women. But Elizabeth, through caution, calculation, and sheer will, ensured it would not be hers. She turned survival into strategy, grief into armor, and the blood of others into the foundation of her rule. Every time she donned her crown, she carried with her the memory of her mother's fall, her cousin's cries, and her rival's death. The sword was always there, waiting. But Elizabeth refused to kneel. Elizabeth's refusal to marry had once been a shield, protection against the fate of her mother, her cousins, and her rivals. But over time, she transformed that shield into a crown. She declared herself not wife, not mother, but Virgin Queen. A woman married not to a man but to England itself. What began as survival became performance. In the glittering halls of her court, Elizabeth's body was no longer her own. It was a stage upon which the kingdom's hopes were written. She dressed in white gowns threaded with pearls, symbols of chastity and divine purity. She painted her face pale, her skin a mask of eternity untouched by age. She allowed portraits to circulate that showed her as ageless, perfect, untouchable. Each image was a lie, but also a weapon. The queen's flesh became propaganda. The myth worked. To her subjects, Elizabeth's virginity was no longer a private matter but a public shield. In an age when a woman's authority was constantly doubted, she claimed a divine aura, almost saintly. That placed her above the reach of ordinary scandal. She was no longer vulnerable to the dangers of the marriage bed or the executioner's sword. She was consecrated, body and crown fused together. England had a queen, but in her it also had a virgin martyr, a mother of the nation. Yet what looked like triumph from the outside carried a bitter cost within. For Elizabeth, intimacy became dangerous, even unthinkable. Every whisper of affection risked scandal. Her closeness to Robert Dudley had nearly destroyed her once. The memory of Amy Robsart's death never fully left her. She knew the court could twist love into a noose, and so she drew back, even with the men she favored. Dudley, later Essex. She withheld herself, always calculating, always guarded. To yield was to risk everything. The price was loneliness. Surrounded always by courtiers, Elizabeth lived in constant company yet deeper isolation. Every word spoken to her was weighed, every smile studied. She could never know who loved her as a woman and who adored her as a queen. Trust became impossible. She filled her court with pageantry, with dances and poetry, but beneath the glitter lay suspicion. To be the Virgin Queen was to belong to everyone and no one. Even her body betrayed her. Smallpox ravaged her face in 1562, leaving scars that had to be painted over. Her teeth blackened with age. Her hair thinned, forcing her to wear elaborate wigs. The immortal image of the Virgin Queen became harder to maintain as time marched on. Yet Elizabeth could never let the mask slip. If she showed herself human, mortal, vulnerable, the myth would collapse, and with it, her fragile authority. The prison was not only personal but political. Foreign suitors had once clamored for her hand: Philip of Spain, the Archduke Charles, the Duke of Anjou. With every proposal rejected, Elizabeth gained leverage, playing one power against another. But as the years passed, the refusals piled up. By the time she reached middle age, the idea of her marriage was no longer bargaining power but impossibility. She had locked herself into her image. The Virgin Queen could never be anyone's bride. The irony was cruel. Elizabeth's most famous act of self-definition was also her cage. She had forged survival from solitude, but the solitude grew heavier with every passing year. She was the most powerful woman in Europe, yet she could not allow herself the simplest of human comforts: a hand to hold in the dark, a heart to trust without suspicion. Even her favorite courtiers betrayed her. Robert de Villars, Earl of Essex, young, brilliant, reckless, became her new favorite in the 1590s. He flattered her, teased her, called her sweet mistress. For a moment, she seemed to bask in his attention. But when Essex's ambition overreached, when he defied her commands, he was condemned. In 1601, Elizabeth signed his death warrant. He was executed on the block like so many before him. The cycle repeated: affection twisted into betrayal, intimacy ending in blood. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth was worshipped as a living legend. Masques, plays, and sermons praised her as a goddess made flesh, a second Virgin Mary ruling over England. Yet in the private chambers of her palaces, she aged in solitude. She stuffed her cheeks with cloth to fill the hollows left by missing teeth. She layered her face with white paint to hide the truth of her body. She was still queen, still untouchable. But she was also alone. The Virgin Queen image had saved her crown, but it had cost her the chance to live as a woman. It was her masterpiece and her prison. From the moment Elizabeth placed the crown upon her head, Europe turned its gaze to her marriage bed. A queen without a husband was an anomaly, a danger to the natural order as her contemporaries saw it. For monarchs and ministers alike, her hand in marriage was not romance but strategy, a gateway to power, an alliance sealed not with parchment but with her body. The list of suitors was long, their ranks glittering with crowns and titles. Philip of Spain, widower of her sister Mary, sought to bind England once again to Catholic power. The Archduke Charles of Austria offered the might of the Habsburg dynasty. The Valois princes of France dangled the promise of continental alliance. Even English noblemen, such as Robert Dudley, whispered their ambitions. Each suitor came not as a lover, but as a claimant to her throne, cloaked in silken words. Elizabeth understood this truth from the beginning. To marry Philip would have been to restore Catholic rule, a return to the fires of persecution that her people still remembered under Mary. To accept a Habsburg husband meant placing England beneath the shadow of the Holy Roman Empire. To wed a French prince risked entangling her kingdom in wars across the Channel. Every proposal carried with it not security but surrender. Her counselors pressed her constantly. William Cecil, her chief advisor, begged her to marry for the stability of the realm. Parliament petitioned her to produce an heir, fearful of the chaos that might follow her death. The pressure was relentless. For in the 16th century a queen without husband or child was an open wound in the body politic. Yet Elizabeth resisted, delaying, promising, and performing a dance of politics that stretched for decades. She learned to turn suitors into pawns. To Spain she offered cautious negotiations, dangling the prospect of a match to keep Philip's aggression restrained. To France, she entertained the attentions of the Duke of Anjou, even allowing him to call her his frog, a grotesque term of endearment that her courtiers mocked but she endured for strategy. Each flirtation was a performance, a stage, managed illusion designed to keep her enemies guessing and her kingdom safe. The Duke of Anjou became the most serious of these candidates. Elizabeth was nearly 50, he nearly 20 years her junior. The court buzzed with rumors, scandal, and disgust. How could the Virgin Queen contemplate marriage at last, and to a Catholic foreign prince? She allowed negotiations to advance, paraded the young Duke before her people, even hinted at affection. Yet at the last moment, she withdrew. The match dissolved, and Anjou returned to France, humiliated. Elizabeth had gained time, nothing more. Her refusals had consequences. Spurned suitors became enemies. Philip of Spain, once her brother-in-law and would-be husband, became her most implacable foe, launching the Armada against England in 1588. The Catholic League of Europe cast her as a heretic and usurper. Her virginity reimagined not as purity but as barrenness, a failure to provide an heir. Each rejection was a survival tactic, but each created new dangers. At home, her choices left deep scars as well. The men closest to her, Robert Dudley above all, hoped that intimacy might blossom into marriage. But when his wife Amy Robsart died mysteriously, the possibility was poisoned forever. Elizabeth could never bind herself to Dudley without confirming the whispers of murder. And so, even in love, betrayal lurked. As the years passed, Elizabeth came to embody contradiction. She was a woman courted by kings yet bound by none. She was praised for her chastity yet accused of cruelty for withholding herself. She was the Virgin Queen, adored in pageantry, yet always one step away from being cast as barren and unnatural. Every suitor who approached her reminded her of the truth she had long understood. Marriage was not sanctuary but surrender. Behind the mask of control lay exhaustion. For Elizabeth, each courtship reopened wounds. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed for failing to please a king. Catherine Howard had suffered the same fate. Mary Stuart had been destroyed by her disastrous marriages, each alliance leading her closer to ruin. Elizabeth could not ignore the pattern carved in blood. Queens who married became victims. Queens who loved too openly became corpses. Thus, her refusals were not only political but deeply personal. To marry meant not only risking her kingdom, but offering herself up to the same fate she had watched consume others. And so, she played the suitors, delayed the decisions, let the petitions pile high, and crafted her own myth in the silence left behind. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth was no longer judged as a woman who had failed to wed, but as a monarch who had turned refusal into empire. She had outlived her suitors, outmaneuvered their ambitions, and built her identity upon the ashes of their proposals. Yet in the quiet of her chambers, she remained a woman alone, her body politic a fortress, her body personal a prison. In a world where a queen was judged by her marriage bed and her womb, Elizabeth stood apart. She would never conceive, never cradle a child, never leave behind an hair of her body. To many of her contemporaries, this was her greatest failure. But for Elizabeth, it was her calculated act of survival. The pressure to bear children began the moment she became queen. Parliament begged her to marry and produce an heir, fearing civil war without a clear successor. Her counselors argued that a dynasty was only secured through blood. Poets wrote of her duty to England, urging her to bring forth sons. Yet Elizabeth knew the dangers too well. In her world, motherhood was not sanctuary but snare. Her own mother, Anne Boleyn, had been condemned for failing to provide Henry VIII with the son he demanded. When Elizabeth was still a child, she had watched Catherine Howard, young, fertile, hopeful, meet the same fate, her body carved apart by an executioner's blade. Queens who carried children carried danger. To be barren was to invite scorn, but to conceive was to gamble with death. Elizabeth also saw how children themselves became weapons. Her cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, bore a son James, but her motherhood could not protect her from scandal, betrayal, and imprisonment. Instead, her child was used against her, a symbol of her weakness, a tool in the hands of her enemies. To bring life into the world as a queen was not to create joy, but to create leverage. And Elizabeth had no intention of placing such a weapon into the grasp of her rivals. There was, too, the haunting fear of childbirth itself. In the 16th century, the act of giving birth was a passage lined with death, infection, hemorrhage, fever. These claimed women of every rank. Even queens did not escape the peril. Jane Seymour, Elizabeth's stepmother, had died bringing Edward into the world. To Elizabeth, the birthing chamber was not a cradle but a battlefield, one she chose never to enter. Instead, she crafted another identity. She declared herself mother to the nation, replacing the absence of personal children with a symbolic bond to her people. Sermons hailed her as the nursing mother of England, the virgin queen who gave life not through her body but through her reign. Her subjects were her children, her realm her family. It was a powerful transformation, one that turned barrenness into strength. But even as she elevated her childlessness into myth, the cost lingered. Behind the portraits and the pageantry was a woman who sometimes confessed, in rare moments of candor, the toll of her solitude. She watched other women bear children, raise heirs, and continue their line. She saw in their lives something she had sacrificed, not merely intimacy but legacy. Elizabeth would rule magnificently, but she would leave behind no son or daughter to carry her name. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun in blood with Henry VII, would end in her. This reality haunted her court. Ministers feared instability, rebellion, even invasion if no heir was named. The absence of a child was not only a personal void but a national crisis. Elizabeth resisted naming a successor, fearing it would invite plots against her life. Yet as years passed, it became clear her refusal to marry had secured her reign. But it had doomed her line. The Tudor torch would die with her. Her enemies used her childlessness as a weapon. Catholic pamphlets sneered that she was barren because she was cursed. Others claimed her refusal to marry proved she was unnatural, unfit, a woman denying her duty to God and man. In their eyes, her empty womb was her greatest shame. But Elizabeth knew better. She had turned that emptiness into armor. Her barrenness was not weakness, it was survival. Every queen before her who had embraced the role of wife and mother had been destroyed by it. Elizabeth, alone, had lived. Her refusal to marry spared her from the executioner's blade, and her refusal to bear a child spared her from creating the very vulnerabilities her enemies could exploit. And yet, the paradox remained. The greatest queen of England's history was also its last Tudor monarch. She preserved her crown but sacrificed her bloodline. The throne that had devoured her mother, her cousins, and her rivals she had kept for herself. But she left no heir to inherit it. Her legacy would pass to the son of Mary Stuart, the very cousin she had executed. Elizabeth's reign was long, glorious, and defiant. But in the silence of her chambers, she carried the knowledge that her survival came at a price. Her childlessness was both triumph and tragedy, a weapon that preserved her rule, and a wound that could never fully heal. The life of Mary Stuart ran alongside Elizabeth's like a distorted reflection, a queen born into peril, bound by blood, ambition, and the ruthless expectations of men. Where Elizabeth resisted the chain of marriage, Mary embraced it, and in each union, she was dragged closer to ruin. Mary became Queen of Scots as an infant, her crown placed upon her head before she could speak. She grew to womanhood in France, wed to Francis II, a marriage that bound her to Catholic power. When he died young, Mary returned to Scotland, carrying with her not only regal beauty, but the weight of foreign ambition. She was praised for her fertility, her youth, her promise to secure dynasties through heirs. In that promise lay her doom. Her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, became a scandalous tragedy. Darnley was arrogant, violent, and unstable. His drunken rages filled the court with fear. Soon he turned against Mary, resenting her authority, humiliating her in public. When her secretary, David Rizzio, became too close, Darnley led men into Mary's chamber and had Rizzio murdered before her eyes. Mary, pregnant at the time, was held down as her friend was stabbed over 50 times. Her womb, celebrated as her crown's security, became her vulnerability. She gave birth to a son, James, but the presence of an heir did not save her. Instead, it made her more dangerous to Elizabeth, for where Elizabeth had only herself, Mary had a child, a legitimate Catholic heir to the English throne. In that infant, rival factions saw opportunity soon after. Darnley himself was found dead under suspicious circumstances, his body discovered strangled beside the ruins of a house blown apart by gunpowder. Rumors swirled that Mary, or those close to her, had arranged his death. When she married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of orchestrating the murder, her reputation collapsed. Passion and ambition had destroyed her standing. Nobles rebelled. Her subjects turned against her. She was forced to abdicate, fleeing to England, to Elizabeth. Here, the two queens became bound in a dance of shadows. Elizabeth, who had rejected marriage to preserve her throne, looked upon her cousin with both pity and horror. Mary had chosen the path. Elizabeth had refused the marriage bed, the child, the promise of dynastic security, and that path had led her to ruin. Elizabeth did not immediately condemn her. At first, she held Mary as a prisoner, a queen in name but a captive in reality. Yet Mary remained dangerous. She was Catholic, she had a son, and to many, she was the rightful Queen of England. From her confinement, conspiracies bloomed. Letters were smuggled, plots devised, rebellions planned in her name. Each scheme pushed Elizabeth closer to a decision she dreaded. For years, Elizabeth resisted. To kill Mary was to kill a fellow anointed queen, to cross a boundary no monarch was meant to violate. It was also to execute her cousin, her mirror, the woman who embodied the dangers she herself had spent a lifetime avoiding. Elizabeth stalled, delayed, refused to sign the warrant, yet the plots multiplied. The Babington conspiracy, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, forced her hand. In 1587, the warrant was signed. Mary was led to the scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. She dressed in crimson, the color of martyrdom, and met her death with dignity. The axe fell clumsily, needing more than one stroke to sever her head. Her lips were said to have moved in prayer, even after the blade struck. Those present swore they would never forget the sound. When Elizabeth was told, she wept. She raged against her counselors, claiming she had never intended the execution to go forward. Yet, whether by hesitation or by strategy, the deed was done. Mary was gone. The death of Mary Stuart was more than an execution. It was a reflection in blood. Elizabeth saw in her cousin the fate she had evaded. Marriage turned to betrayal, motherhood turned to weapon, love twisted into destruction. By refusing those chains, Elizabeth had preserved her crown. But the cost was clear. She would never hold a child of her own, never know a partner's trust, never share her burden. Where Mary had been consumed by passion, Elizabeth had been consumed by solitude. And yet, the shadow of Mary lingered. Her son James grew strong in Scotland, biding his time. The Tudor line would end with Elizabeth, but the Stuart line, born from Mary's body, baptized in her blood, would inherit her throne. In death, Mary achieved what she could not in life. In March of 1603, the queen who had outlasted kings, plots, betrayals, and even time itself began her final decline. Elizabeth Tudor was 70 years old, ancient by the measure of her century, and her body had become a relic of survival, gaunt and brittle, yet unwilling to surrender. Even as death crept closer, she would not lie down. To lie down was to admit weakness. To rest was to make herself vulnerable, and Elizabeth had never permitted herself that luxury. The courtiers who crept into her chambers in Richmond Palace whispered of her wasted form, her face now a mask of pallor and shadow. The wigs, the paint, the jewels, all the armor of monarchy, had slipped away. What remained was a figure haunted, skeletal, almost spectral, still commanding silence by sheer force of will. She would not allow her physicians to touch her, would not allow prayers for her recovery. She had spent a lifetime refusing men's claims to her body. She would not begin to yield in death. Elizabeth sat upright on cushions, motionless for hours, staring into the dim air as if she were seeing not the flicker of candles, but the faces of her ghosts. And there were so many. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, whose body had been broken on the scaffold because she could not give Henry VIII a son. Catherine Howard, another stepmother, another wife destroyed. her head severed for alleged adultery. Lady Jane Grey, the child queen who had worn a crown for 9 days before it brought her to the axe. Mary Stuart, Elizabeth's cousin and rival, whom Elizabeth herself had condemned to death. Marriage, intimacy, the politics of the bed, all of it had carried women she knew to their graves. Elizabeth had survived by denying it all, but survival had come at the price of a hollow, solitary throne. For decades, she had ruled as the Virgin Queen, married only to her country, her body politic transformed into a symbol of national unity. The image had served her. It made her untouchable, a queen above the grasp of any husband. But in her last days, stripped of ceremony, that image curdled into torment. She was not simply a ruler without a husband. She was a woman without a child, without an heir, without the comfort of family to surround her bed as the end approached. Her counselors begged her to rest. They urged her to name her successor. But Elizabeth shook her head. She no longer spoke freely, her words reduced to whispers, but she understood what it meant to name another was to let go. And she would not let go. The courtiers whispered that she was haunted, not just by memory but by visions. Some said she saw shadows dancing in the corners of her chamber, others that she confessed to hearing her mother's voice. Perhaps she did. Elizabeth's reign had been built upon the graves of women who had failed to survive the dangerous union of power and desire. Now, at the edge of death, their absence pressed upon her like a sentence long deferred. It was not an illness that carried her away, at least not one that doctors could name. It was exhaustion, a lifetime of vigilance, the crushing weight of solitude. She refused food. She refused medicine. She refused to close her eyes for more than minutes at a time. She sat upright, gaunt as a figure carved in ivory, wrapped in robes that hung from her bones. To those who saw her, she seemed already half in the grave, as if she had turned into her own monument before breath had left her. At last, when her strength ebbed beyond even her iron will, she allowed herself to be carried to a pallet laid upon the floor. Not a bed. She would not concede that final surrender. Surrounded by terrified attendants, she drifted in and out of silence. A few words slipped from her cracked lips of God, of her crown, of her cousin James of Scotland who would succeed her, and then nothing. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I, Queen of England, last of the Tudor line, died. Alone, childless, unmarried, the Virgin Queen, her body, when embalmed, bore the marks of her long vigil. A mouth locked shut, a face stretched thin over bone, eyes sunken yet unyielding. Even in death she seemed to resist. Her reign had been an empire built not upon fertility, but upon denial, upon a woman's refusal to let her body be used as a bargaining chip in men's games. England had flourished under her. Theaters, voyages, victories, a golden age of poetry and war, but all of it had been sustained by her emptiness, by the womb she had refused to fill, by the bed she had refused to share. The dynasty ended with her because she had made her body the shield of her crown, and so she passed into legend, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. But the reality was more chilling. Elizabeth had defied marriage, defied men, defied even death until her body simply failed her. Yet the cost of that defiance was solitude deeper than any prison, a loneliness carved into her bones. Her final legacy was not simply the empire she left behind, but the warning written in her life that for women, in the brutal world of crowns and swords, survival could be won, but only by becoming untouchable, unclaimed, and utterly alone.